there, folks. Today we are starting Unit 6, and Unit 6 is all about the build-up to the American Civil War and the aftermath, Reconstruction and regrowth after the American Civil War in the 1860s and beyond. The first lesson is 6.01, Growing Apart. And let's first read this introduction to Unit 6, and then we'll begin the 6.01 lesson. During the Revolutionary era, compromise kept the new nation intact. More compromise allowed ratification of the United States Constitution, but difficult issues could not go unresolved forever. Who held the nation's supreme power, the states or the federal government? And that's an issue we have heard time and time again. Over the nullification crisis, over other issues. Who has more power, the states or the federal government? Could a nation survive half slave and half free? Would there be slavery in new states? Would agriculture or urban industry shape the future? It took the tragedy of Civil War to answer these and other questions. In the end, over 600,000 Americans perished and lands, towns, and livelihoods were destroyed. But the horror of slavery ended, and a nation founded on democratic ideals survived its greatest challenge. Lesson 1, Growing Apart. The decade leading up to the Civil War was a time of turmoil and transition. Questions seemingly settled by the Missouri Compromise of 1820 came to the forefront again. Slavery was the focus of the Wilmot Proviso, the Compromise of 1850, and the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Popular sovereignty was one response to slavery. Legislation and compromise were others. Nothing lasted, and the nation moved slowly and inexorably toward the Civil War. Goals for this lesson: recognize the views of the North and South toward each other by 1850, identify the goal and major provisions of the Compromise of 1850, and identify Harriet Beecher Stowe and Uncle Tom's Cabin and its impact. Don't forget to access the reading guide from Lesson Resources. You have the reading guide and the lesson answer key available for you, so you can certainly be filling that out or going through that as you go through the reading. We're going to read pages 390 through 402. Okay, so let's start with that. With our reading. The Road to War. At the start of the Mexican-American War, Ralph Waldo Emerson, the transcendentalist philosopher and poet, predicted the United States will conquer Mexico, but it will be as a man who swallows the arsenic, which brings him down in turn. Mexico will poison us. Emerson understood that the acquisition of new Western territories would reopen the debate over slavery and cause a fatal split between the North and the South. Time proved him right. The fate of slavery and its extension into the territories gained in the Mexican-American War dominated and divided the Union. The debate escalated into what Senator William Henry Seward of New York accurately described as an irrepressible conflict. The Wilmot Proviso. On the evening of August 8, 1846, Pennsylvania Congressman David Wilmot rose on the House of Representatives and proposed amending the routine funding bill for the Mexican-American War. Wilmot was a Democrat and a supporter of the war. The hour was growing late, and Wilmot's colleagues were eager to finish the business and flee the sticky summer heat of D.C. The last thing they wanted to do was debate the issue of slavery. But Wilmot had other plans. His amendment, soon dubbed the Wilmot Proviso, was simple. He proposed slavery be banned in whatever territories the United States acquired from Mexico. The House quickly erupted. For years, the chamber had been governed by a strict gag rule that forbade any discussion of slavery. Now the topic could not be avoided. Within minutes, party discipline broke down. Southerners, both Whigs and Democrats alike, stood up to defend the institution of slavery. Northern Democrats and Whigs banded together to call for a stop to the spread of this peculiar institution. In the vote that followed, Northern congressmen of both parties prevailed and passed the Wilmot Proviso in the House. But in the Senate, the measure failed to gain a majority of votes, so it did not become law. Nevertheless, the significance of the House vote was clear. As if by magic, observed the newspaper, it brought a head to the great question that is about to divide the American people. So remember, to pass anything, you have to have the House and the Senate vote it through, both parts of the legislative branch. Before the controversy over the Wilmot Proviso, the last time Congress had so fiercely debated slavery was in the proceedings leading up to the Missouri Compromise of 1820. The agreement reached in the Missouri Compromise had held for over 3 decades. According to the law, all territory north of the 36° north parallel was free soil, that is, land worked by free laborers, while all territory south of that latitude was open to slavery. Since most of land acquired from Mexico lay below the parallel, it seemed likely much of it would be open to slavery, leading the establishment of even more slave states. But the situation was not so clear-cut. The Missouri Compromise applied only to land that the United States acquired from France in the Louisiana Purchase. The Missouri Compromise said nothing about any new territories the United States might acquire in future years. There was no law governing the spread of slavery in the lands gained from the Mexican secession. To many Americans, these new western lands represented the future of the nation. Would the West look like the North or the South? By extension, what kind of country would the United States be by the century's end? The North's critique of the South. In an antebellum era, while a majority of Northerners wanted to stop the spread of slavery into the Western territories, most did not regard themselves as abolitionists or believe in equality for black people. There was a difference between being an abolitionist and being anti-slavery. In the North, abolitionists were a vocal minority, but a minority nonetheless. Most white Northerners considered black people inferior and had little patience for abolitionists who argued for equality for black people. Because of his outspoken views, William Lloyd Garrison was dragged through the streets of Boston with a noose around his neck. Another abolitionist, Wendell Phillips, had to slip out the back of Northern churches when angry parishioners turned against him for preaching equality of blacks and whites. While most white Northerners did not support racial equality, by the late 1840s many had come to view slavery as an evil institution. Their opposition to slavery combined economic and moral arguments. When white Northerners looked at their own section, they saw a dynamic economy that included both agriculture and industry. They took pride in their roads, canals, and railroads, as well as a thriving artistic and literary culture. They promoted values of thrift and hard work. In their view, the South represented the opposite of all the North valued. William Henry Seward, who served New York as governor and in the U.S. Senate, traveled to Virginia. He reported that an exhausted soil, old and decaying towns, wretchedly neglected roads, and in every respect an absence of enterprise and improvement, distinguish the region through which we have come, in contrast to that which we live. Such has been the effect of slavery. Northerners like Seward believed that a free labor system encouraged hard work and creativity. As they saw it, when every man would rise or fall according to his own efforts, then people will be motivated to do their best. In a free labor society, farmers and craftsmen also had extra incentive to be educated so as to find more and efficient ways to make money. For such reasons, thought Seward, the North was thriving. In the South, however, slaves had little incentive to work hard. As the Northern newspaper editor Horace Greeley asserted, enslave a man and you destroy his ambition, his enterprise, and his capacity. Another anti-slavery writer explained that a slave knows that however much of revenue he may produce, his own share will be strictly limited to the necessities of life. By this reasoning, why would a slave work harder or be more creative if he would never enjoy the fruits of his labor? Northerners argued that slavery sapped the ambition not only of slaves but of their white masters. Seward claimed, "Go ask Virginia, go and you ask noble Maryland, to show her your people, canals, railroads, universities, schools, charities, and cultivated areas." Virginia and Maryland lacked this benefit, Seward implied, because of slavery. By this line of reasoning, Northerners concluded that slavery was a drag not only on the South's economy, but on its general state of civilization. Most Northerners did not care one way or another about the plight of black slaves, but they came to see slavery as evil because, in the words of one critic, slavery withers and blights all it touches. To prevent this moral and economic blight from spreading, Northerners were determined to confine slavery to the areas where it already existed. The South's critique of the North. When Southerners looked north, they did not see the land of hard-working, thrift, self-reliant laborers that Northerners boasted of. Southerners charged that urbanization and industrialization bred poverty and inequality in the North. Southern critics asserted that wage laborers in northern factories were worse off than slaves. Your whole hireling class of manual laborers and operatives, you call them, are essentially slaves, South Carolina governor wrote. The difference between us is that our slaves are hired for life and well compensated, which they weren't. Yours are hired by the day and not cared for and scantily compensated. As Hammond and other Southerners saw, the typical slave enjoyed more protections against hunger and sickness than the typical wage laborer. Above all, when they looked to the North, Southerners were troubled by the rise of inequality between different classes of white people. In the South, even the poorest white man was always a step above a black man. At least in principle, his white skin placed him in a state of civic equality with the richest plantation owner. But in the North, increasing numbers of white men and women were living in a state of social and economic inferiority to wealthier whites. "Free society," cried a Southern newspaper, "we sicken at the name. What is it but a conglomeration of greasy mechanics, filthy operatives, and a small farmers who do their own drudgery, and yet are hardly fit for association with the Southern gentleman's body servant." The rise of economic inequality in the North had serious political implications. Many Americans still believe that political independence and economic independence went hand in hand. This idea stretched back to the American Revolution. If a man owned his own farmer shop, he was not beholden to anyone else. But a wage laborer, for instance, a factory worker or a hired hand, owed his job to his boss. His financial dependence on his employer made him vulnerable to his employer's political influence, or so the reasoning went. One South Carolinian proclaimed, "The great evil of the North free society is its burden with the servile class of mechanics and laborers, unfit for self-government, yet clothed with the attributes and powers of citizens." Southerners did not let their slaves vote, but Northerners let their wage laborers participate fully in politics, even if, as Southerners charged, laborers participating as the pawns of the wealthy. Thus, as the South saw it, the wage labor system seemed both economically and politically evil. The Compromise of 1850. For Northerners and Southerners alike, the debate over slavery focused less on the rights of black people and more on a set of competing economic and social values. Important there. It was a disagreement over whether the United States should be a free labor society or a slave society, and in fact it was a debate over the essential nature of the American Republic. In this light, the new land gained from the Mexican-American War posed a great challenge. In that conflict, the United States acquired present-day California, New Mexico, Arizona, Utah, and Nevada, as well as parts of Colorado and Wyoming. These western lands represented the future of the Republic. Whether they were slave or free would determine what kind of country America would be. In 1850, the slavery debate boiled over. Southerners, invoking the Missouri Compromise of 1820, demanded an extension of the north latitude boundary across the whole continent. Such a measure would open most of Mexico's accession to slavery, and we'll look at that map closer in a minute. Further apart, every northern legislature except one called for a ban on slavery in the new territories. Furthermore, the consternation of Southerners, several northern states passed personal liberty laws, which protected fugitive slaves who crossed over to free soil from being returned to their owners. Southerners had hopes that the new president, Zachary Taylor, would support their cause. A Whig and former general who commanded troops in the war with Mexico, Taylor was a Southerner and a slave owner. So it came as a surprise when in December he called for the immediate admission of California to the Union as a free state. Soon after, he suggested that New Mexico also join the Union and that its citizens decide for themselves whether to enter as a free or slave state. At the time, there were 15 free and 15 slave states. Because its population was growing at a faster rate, the North already enjoyed a numerical advantage in the House of Representatives. If California and New Mexico entered the Union as free states, the North would also enjoy a majority in the Senate. With tensions running high, Senator Henry Clay of Kentucky stepped in to mediate the crisis. Clay no longer resembled the young man who had guided the Missouri Compromise through the Senate. He was failing health, his face more gaunt and worn than ever, but he was still strong in mind and spirit. He warned his colleagues on both sides of the House that war and dissolution of the Union are identical and inevitable. The only way out was to compromise. To keep the peace, Clay's Compromise of 1850 proposed 8 measures. California be admitted as a free state. The residents of the remaining territories acquired from Mexico would decide for themselves whether to allow slavery within their borders. A long-standing border dispute between New Mexico and Texas would be settled in New Mexico's favor. The United States would assume responsibility for Texas's pre-war debt. Slavery would not be abolished in Washington, D.C. The slave trade, however, would be abolished in Washington, D.C. Congress would pledge not to interfere with the domestic slave trade outside of the nation's capital. Congress would pass a new and tougher fugitive slave law. The debate over Clay's bill went on for months. Okay, and I'm going to keep going. Southern extremists known as fire eaters loudly complained the compromise favored the free states. None was as outspoken as Calhoun. Only weeks away from his death, he had to be carried into the chamber where he read a speech. And we'll skip over that. Unless others were permitted to carry slaves in the territories, he declared, they would surely be compelled to leave the Union. In turn, hard... Okay, and I'm going to stop here because I'm almost out of time, and we'll